Hello, everybody. Thanks again for visiting my YouTube channel. Here is the place where we discuss the Lord's Recovery Movement of Witness Lee, also known as the local church movement. I've consciously tried to avoid deep theological subjects. I've mostly focused on what I feel is the greatest weakness of the Lord's Recovery, their greatest offense, which is the abuse of spiritual authority. And most of my posts have crisscrossed that in some kind of way to point out what is my main desire, and that is people would understand that they do not have to submit to this group or its leaders. But there's other things to talk about, and I've avoided the theological subjects because you tend to get all wound up in them and get distracted from the main focus. But at the same time, sometimes it's helpful to talk about these things to get a better understanding of God, a better understanding of what He requires of us, and a better understanding of how the Lord's recovery errs in some of these areas or gets imbalanced and thereby helps create the situation where you are held there because of a lack of a proper understanding of what God is really like. So today we're going to jump in the deep waters and talk about the Trinity or the Triune God. There is a publication put out by the Living Stream Ministry which started back in 1996, and the very first issue and the very first article was an article which was called Axioms of the Trinity, written by Kerry Robichaux, who's one of the Living Stream Ministry theologians. And good grief, this was 23 years ago now. So he and I were both a lot younger back then, and I'm not sure what he's up to these days. But I always kind of liked this article. I thought it was well written and pretty well thought out. But it is a particular view of the Trinity which is designed to be compatible with Witness Lee's view. And Witness Lee's view of the Trinity was that the Trinity was for God's dispensing. Now that's a mouthful, and you have to unpack that and see what he means by that. Dispensing is a word that Witness Lee coined. And he's about the only one I've ever heard that uses it in regard to what God is doing, but basically means that God is giving himself away or pouring himself out into people. He is dispensing himself. He is flowing himself out. He is he is making himself available. He is an eternal fountain which can pour into us and by which we can share him in our innermost being. That's okay as far as that goes. But I'll get into a couple of things about it. First off, the word dispensing itself is rather clinical and impersonal, I would say. It's true, but it's also true to say a kiss is the application of one's lips against someone else's lips. It kind of loses the emotional and relational aspect of the action. Dispensing, it sounds very clinical. It's like to me what a pharmacist does when he fills a prescription. It's just very clinical. What does it really mean, dispensing in this case? What's the essence of what he's trying to say with dispensing? He's trying to say the person is sharing themselves with you. They are opening themselves to you and giving themselves to you in a way that allows you to experience them in the most intimate way. In other words, it's personal, it's relational, it's definitely emotional, it's spiritual. It is a complete sharing of one's being with another person in the most complete way possible. It's not just putting yourself into somebody, because when you talk about putting yourself into somebody, again, if you don't think about it in the right way, you miss the relational aspect of it. You miss the emotional aspect of it. You miss the aspect that it's a matter of two people sharing one another with each other. And that's personal. When you think of sex, sex is a physical picture of what is going on with us and God spiritually. If you take away kind of our semi-animalistic approach to it, if you think about it in what it really is, it's a complete sharing of oneself, complete opening and giving and not hiding, completely transparent. It's almost a little embarrassing to talk about because these kind of intimate relationships are so personal. Well, that's what dispensing is or should be. But another problem with the idea that God is triune for dispensing implies that God is triune and has always been triune only because he was going to create us and dispense into us. When Witness Lee says God is triune for dispensing, it's all focused on us and God's relationship with us. In other words, God exists so he could create us and dispense into us, is kind of what he's saying when he says God is triune for dispensing. It doesn't talk about why God is triune in himself. Why, in the first place, was God triune? It is kind of a stretch to say the only reason God is triune is because he would eventually create man. And this is what Robichaud implies in the last sentence in his article. He says, to be sure, man exists because God is triune. And another way of saying that is God is triune because man would exist. That's what Witness Lee was saying. I would think that it's better to try to understand why God is triune in himself. In other words, why was he triune in the first place in himself? And I think the best explanation for that is the explanation which comes from John Piper, which originated with John Edwards. It may have come from some other places, but Edwards really talked about it in an essay that was very wordy and hard to read because it was in archaic English. But Piper talks about it succinctly in a web page, desiringgod.org/articles/love-seeking-understanding. You can go to that, you can read about it, but to me it's the thing that makes most sense. And it makes the most sense from the standpoint of a lot of things, especially about how we are in God's image and how we, in a sense, are each triune, are trinities. Essentially, the story is that God, the Father, is a person who, through his appreciation of himself, begot the Son, who is the perfect image of himself. And he has a relationship of love with this perfect image of himself. And that relationship, that flow of love between him and the other person, is the Spirit. One of the problems with Robichaud and Witness Lee's Trinity is they never explain really why the Spirit exists except in terms of dispensing into man. They don't explain why there is a Spirit in God himself. You can sort of understand why there's a Father and a Son, but they don't explain really what the Spirit is. To them, the Spirit is just the dispensing tool of God to dispense into us. But if you think about it in terms of an individual who has self-consciousness and has a good relationship with himself, then you can think of the person, as his image of himself, which he appreciates, and as the flow of love between he and his image of himself. And the source is the Father, the image is the Son, and the flow of love between them is the Spirit. So viewing it this way dovetails perfectly with the Son being the image of the Father. How is he the image of the Father? He is the Father's conception of himself. He is, so to speak, the Father's self-image. And it also gives a reason why the Bible talks about the love between the Father and the Son, but it never talks about the love of the Father and the Son for the Spirit, or of the Spirit's love for them. The Spirit is the love between the Father and the Son. The Spirit is the fellowship between the Father and the Son. And that is why the Spirit is always about fellowship in the Bible. And that's why our fellowship is always in the Spirit. Because the Spirit is the reality of God's experience of himself. It is where, so to speak, God makes contact with himself. Which is why it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 that no one knows the inner workings of God except the Spirit of God. The Spirit is God's most vital and inward experience of himself. He's all about experience. He's all about reality. He's all about fellowship. He's all about contact because he's the reality of God. That's why he's our reality of God. He's our experience of God. So why am I talking about this? Well, for one reason, it really helps me understand the Trinity, and it helps me understand how I'm like God in the sense of I have a relationship with myself. And my relationship is supposed to be a relationship of appreciation for myself and a healthy love for myself. when you get right down to it, that relationship, that conscious relationship you have with yourself is you. So all three are you. You are you. Your image of yourself is you. And your relationship with yourself is you. And they're all fully you. So in that sense, you can see how all three could be distinct, and yet all three are completely God. God in himself is completely God. God's image of himself is completely God. And God's relationship with himself is completely God. Somehow at God's level, his image of himself is another person. Now, I don't really understand how that happens, but I think it's because of God's perfection. His appreciation of himself is absolutely complete and full and perfect to the point where it just is him. In other words, he's looking in the mirror, and not only is the image in the mirror just an image, the image in the mirror is actually so much a perfect image of him that it is another person. So God loves himself as if he was another person. Think about that. That also dovetails with love your neighbor as yourself. The flip side of love your neighbor as yourself is love yourself as your neighbor, which is another way of saying love yourself as if you were someone else. So maybe the best expression of self-love is to love yourself as if yourself was a different person. Think about that for a second. I told you we were getting in the deep water. Like I said, this is well above any of our pay grades, but that's the way I understand the Trinity. So, what is the point? The point is God is at his very essence relational. It's about having a conscious, loving, full, giving, pouring out relationship. And I don't think that idea is summed up well enough in the word dispensing. To me, dispensing sounds very impersonal. Now, they may not mean it that way, but that's the way it sounds to me, and I think that's the way it sounds to a lot of people. The problem with Lee's Trinity is he lost sight of this love between the Father and the Son because he was always saying the Father is the Son and the Son is the Spirit. And in a sense that's true, and you can see from my explanation that it's also true. Yet, in Lee's way of talking about it, he left out the relational part. And so, to me, it is interesting that there's also an underappreciation of relationships in the Lord's Recovery itself, or a downplaying of them. There is not a healthy appreciation, not only of relationships with others, but that's the way it's mostly expressed. No friends, everything's real, cut and dried, and can't get too close to people. You don't want to be natural, brothers and sisters, and we don't have any close ties with each other. And then the whole thing of our relationship with God is this clinical dispensing, rather impersonal. And then the relationship with yourself is weird because it's always about you're denying yourself, don't love yourself, don't think about yourself, you're nothing, you're nobody. There's this kind of emptiness to it where there's this lack of fulfillment in the sense of a full and loving and fulfilling relationship. So I think once again what happened with Witness Lee is I'm not sure if his Trinitarian view affected his relational view or his relational view affected his Trinitarian view. It might have been both. It may have been because he had a rather impersonal type of attitude about people that affected his view of God himself. But if you think about it, every healthy person has a healthy relationship with himself. God likes himself. He appreciates himself. He wouldn't ask us to worship him if he didn't appreciate himself. He doesn't have any problem with himself. He looks at himself and he sees perfection. How are you going to feel about it if you look at yourself and you see absolute, total perfection? How are you not going to like that, love that completely? And so in God, that love is expressed. It's so pure, it's so holy, it's so elevated that it's expressed as a love for another person. When we're talking about the Trinity, we need to be talking about full spiritual, emotional, conscious, loving, completely giving relationships. And if you're talking about dispensing and you're talking about that, then you're getting it right. But if you're talking about just water pouring out of one beaker into another, you're missing a big part of it. because it is always personal, it is always relational, it is always conscious, it's always about two people. It's not about stuff going from one thing to another. But I wanted to talk about this because I think people in the Lord's Recovery think Witness Lee had the best definition of the Trinity going. And I find it lacking because I think it's focusing on process more than relationship. And God is always, 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 always about the relationship between Him and Himself, between Him and us, between us and ourselves, and between us and each other. That's what He's always about. And Robichaux gets some of that in his article, but he misses some of it too. So here I am, 23 years later, to talk about what he wrote. That's it for now. Take care.